Hey everyone, it's Hawk, back again with another tier list for Divide and Conquer version 4.5, this time for the Goblins of Moria. Just before we get started, I want to, first of all, thank, I forget which of my viewers, but one of my viewers recommended that I do the Goblins of Moria, which I've kind of been dreading this one because the Goblins of Moria have a lot of trash and are going to rank generally lower than the other factions, but hey, we had to do them eventually, and I think it'll be quite fun to do the Goblins of Moria. But also, I want to just quickly go over my tiering criteria one more time, just specify a few things because I got some questions about it based on my last two videos. First of all, people were mostly asking whether or not I'm ranking it based on how good the units are throughout all of the factions in the game or just within their own faction. And it's a combination of both. For S tier in particular, it needs to be a really good unit throughout the entire game. Compared to all other factions, it needs to be one of the best-in-class units, incredibly good. It needs to stand out among every unit in the game. So that's S tier, but all the other ones takes into account both. It really just depends. If it's a really, really good unit for your faction, that'll gain it some points, but if it's not as good across the rest of the units in the game, it'll lose some points based on that. So it's a little bit of both. I would say I am putting more stock in how good the unit is across every faction, but that's not the only thing. It's more like a 60-40%. It's not a huge disparity. And then the other thing I should mention is that someone recommended that I don't include the look of the unit into the tiering, and I just want to say that the look of the unit would not increase the tiers by a lot. So for example, if I had a unit in C tier, but I thought it looked really good, it wouldn't bump it up a whole tier or two just because it looks good. It's more just if I'm deciding between whether or not it's B or C tier, but hey, it's a really good looking unit, I would pop it up to B tier based on that. But it's more just something to comment on. It is not putting a whole lot of stock in the tiering at all. With all that being said, let's get started with the Goblins of Moria, starting with the Naga Stalkers, the absolute trash infantry unit of the game. They are the epitome of trash, but they're still D tier in my eyes. And I know you're probably wondering what, but they have terrible stats. They have 2 attack and 2 defense, 0 armor. They're horrible. Yes, they are. But there are worse units in the Misty Mountains roster, in my opinion, that are coming up. And with that being said, 2 attack means that they can physically kill things, kind of, and they are good at doing what they do. They have 100 men in the EDB, or in the EDU, which means that they have 250 soldiers on the battle map, which is quite a lot. And they are really, really good at doing what they're supposed to do, which is tie up enemy units and die. And the Naga Stalkers do that just fine. They might take a few with them, they will rout immediately, but they can tie up units for your quote-unquote more elite units to take them down. But overwhelming numbers is the name of the game for the Goblins of Moria, and it is not about any one individual unit. And the Naga Stalkers embody that to the fullest extent. They are most certainly not an average unit, but I do not think they are at the bottom of the barrel of trash. The bottom of the barrel of trash is reserved for the other 2 units standing next to them, the Naga Skirmishers and the Naga Archers. We'll start with the Naga Skirmishers. The Naga Skirmishers, in my opinion, are just worse than the Naga Stalkers. They only have a 1 melee attack and 1 defense. They do not get that shield that the Naga Stalkers have. And yes, they have a javelin, but it's a terrible javelin. They're not going to kill many things with their javelins. And they're just worse other than that. They only get 2 javelins with a 4. Terrible. That is probably the lowest javelin attack in the game. A 4 missile attack that is not effective against armor. They will hardly kill anything with their javelins, and then once they're done with their 2 volleys, they are strictly worse. Yes, again, they are good at dying, and they can do things like that, but they're super vulnerable to cav charges, being shot at. They just can't do anything. They're a horrible unit. I really just think if you need frontline trash, you're better off just training the Naga Stalkers. So the Naga Skirmishers land themselves in F tier. And then the Naga Archers. The Naga Archers now, I think, are better than the Naga Skirmishers, but again, they're just not very good. They have a 1 missile attack, and they have 0 defense. That's right, 0. Literally anything that hits the Naga Archers will kill them. They cannot defend themselves in any way. And they are horrible archers. They have a 1 missile attack within 130 range, which is incredibly short. 16 arrows, that's nothing. These people will hardly kill anything. Again, if you want trash, just take your stalkers and be gone. You have another pretty terrible archer, but just better. Yes, they're dirt cheap. Yes, they can just supplement your armies, but I really can't see the Naga Archers getting any serious kills. So for that reason, they are an F tier. Now, it should be noted that I've actually never played the Goblins of Moria. They're one of the few factions in the game that I've never played. So maybe my tier list is entirely wrong, and I have no idea what I'm talking about just because I'm going off of limited experience with the faction. But the Naga Archers are the worst archer unit in the game. 0 defense is terrible. Just get your Goblin units to replace these guys. So F tier, they're just terrible. They're just terrible. Now we have the Goblin Band. And now the Goblin Band can actually do something. They're a C tier. They are average for what they do. Across everything in the game, they are still incredibly low tier. I mean, they only have a 3 melee attack and an 8 defense. But 3 melee attack and 8 defense means that they can actually exist. They might be able to do something. They will live for far longer than your Snaga, and they will kill far more things than your Snaga. And they're still dirt cheap, and there are still 250 of them on the battle map, which means that they can get stuff done. Again, they're there to die, but the overwhelming numbers of the Goblin Band makes them a good enough unit. They won't beat any serious unit from any humans, elves, or dwarves, but they can keep up and at least tie units down for a while. I think that they do their job well, and so that is what lands them in the C tier. And the same thing goes for the Goblin Infantry. The Goblin Infantry are basically the more aggressive version in that they have 1 more attack and 1 less defense, which means that they're very similar. But 1 more attack, 1 less defense. Same thing as the Goblin Band. Dirt cheap, overwhelming numbers. They can do their job fine, even though as an individual unit, they're still incredibly lacking. So these two get into C tier. They do the job. They do the job of tying up units and actually getting kills while they do so. The Goblin Archers are going to be D tier. Again, the Archers are going to be in a lower tier because this time we have a 2 missile attacks. We've doubled from the Snaga. 140 meter range, so we've gone up 10, but they still only have 16 missiles. Their accuracy is still absolutely terrible. They do actually have a defense stat now. They have a 5 defense, 3 of which is an armor. And there are a lot of them, but there's not 250 of them, which should be noted. So they're still really not a good unit. They will not kill that much. They have the same amount of missiles, which means that despite having twice as much missile attack, they're not going to be shooting for any longer, so they're not going to be getting as more kills than you would hope, I guess. Because they will still only shoot those 16 missiles. Their range only increased by 10, so 140 is still terrible. Everything else is just bad, and there's not as many of them, whereas the Naga Archers, I believe, have the 250-man battalion, if I look. Oh, no, they do not. But they have more. In the EDU, the Naga Archers have 90, which means times 2.5 is 225-ish men, whereas the Goblin Archers have 80, which means that they will have 200 men or so. Or 200 orcs. So there's not as many of them, despite their double missile attack. They're still not going to kill that many things, but they are your early tier archer. You'll still train them when you want them, but just in the grand scheme of things, Goblin Archers are not a very good unit. Now we come to the Mountain Orc Hunters. And the Mountain Orc Hunters are also D tier. Now, actually, I don't know. The Mountain Orc Hunters are tough. The Mountain Orc Hunters could be D tier or C tier in my eyes, because there are things that make them a good unit, and there are things that make them a terrible unit. And so I think that averages out maybe to make them D tier. In that they do have 7 melee attack that is effective against armor, which is quite good. That really will mince through units, and again, they have a 200-man battalion on the battle map, so that means that they can really carve through other units. They also have a movement speed bonus, which is really nice. They move 110% faster, and they can hide anywhere. So they can, and they also frighten enemy units, which is also very handy. You know what? They frighten units. They'll get up to C tier just based on that. So they are very, very aggressive with their 7 AP damage, frightening enemy units, being able to hide anywhere to set up ambushes, being faster. If they can get in on the flank, which they have an easy time of doing based on those attributes, they will really carve through other units. But they have 0 armor and only 5 defense skill, which means that arrow fire will ruin them. They have 0 defense to arrows, which means anything that hits them will kill them. And they still only have 5 defense, so even when in melee, they will die very quickly. They have less defense than your other goblin infantry units. They only have 5. They will die super fast once they're in melee, so it's basically shock, get a bunch of kills, and then this unit will die off. But they're still effective against armor. They have a lot of aggressive attributes, so they do the job that they're meant to do, which bumps them up to C tier. And frightening enemy units is very handy to get morale breaks on the back line. Now we have the Orc Fighters or Orc Looters, I don't remember what they're called, and then the Orc Hunters. And this is another reason why the Naga Skirmishers are F tier, because the Orc Hunters are just a better version of them, and then this unit is going to be D tier because your Goblin Infantry is a better version of them. Now, let me explain. The Orc Hunters just have a better missile attack, and they're still dirt cheap, and they will actually kill things. So if I go up here, the Raider Skirmishers, which is this javelin unit, they have a missile attack of 6, still in 2 javelins, but they get they have 6 damage this time, which is quite a boost as opposed to the 4 that the Naga Skirmishers have. Yes, there are less of them, but they're also competent in melee. They have a 3 melee attack with 4 defense, which means that once they're done, they can get into melee, and they're still better than your Snaga units. So all around, they're a lot better, and they're still dirt cheap. You can train a ton of these. So there's no reason to train Snaga Skirmishers when you can train the superior Orc Hunter Skirmisher things. I don't know the exact name. I think they're called Orc Hunters. And then the Orc Looters or Orc Fighters are just worse than your Goblin Infantry. They are more aggressive. They have a 6 melee attack, but they only have a 5 defense, as opposed to the 7 that your Goblin Infantry has. There's really nothing that makes them stand out. They're just worse, and they are more expensive, and there are a lot of them, but there's nothing that makes them any better than your normal Goblin units, and they cost significantly more. They cost about almost 100 more coins to train than your Goblin units, so you may as well just get these because you can get more of them. And they also don't have the 250, they only have 225 or so orcs in the unit. So they're just inferior, but they're still not like complete bottom of the barrel trash. They're just not that good. Now we're finally going to see the unit that actually does pretty well. The Arik Overseers are A tier, specifically because they can do the chanting that inspires your units. Also, they have still passable stats. They have a 7 melee attack with a 17 defense. Now, a lot of that is in armor, so effective against armor will hit them. And they do have a very small battalion as well, so you definitely don't want to get this unit in melee. But if you need them to get in melee, they can get in there and do some damage. They are also armor piercing, which means that 7 melee attack goes a long way. So they're a decent unit if they're forced to go in melee, but they will keep your troops in the battle by chanting and inspiring your troops, which is a big, big boost to your trash lines with low, terrible morale all around. Arik Overseers are definitely going to be something you want in every army, just to keep your troops around. And if they're forced to go in melee, they're a solid unit for early tier. Just be careful about effective against armor. But they're definitely a very, very, very good unit. This is an example of a unit getting ranked highly because of how helpful they are in your own roster, your own faction's roster. So helpful to have the chanting and a unit that can actually stick around in a fight and won't just cease to exist. And they will also help your unit stick around. So very, 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 very good unit for you. You will train them even in the late game to keep your units around, for sure. Now we come on to our early tier Warg units, and they're fine. The Warg Riders, as far as cavalry go, are super... Jeez, these UIs are really not looking good for the Warg Riders and the Warg Scouts. I apologize for that. But the Warg Riders they're still cavalry, so they're still an average unit. They will kill things, but they're not that good. With that being said, they have a 7 melee attack, so they're quite aggressive, and they have a 25% movement speed bonus, which means they are quite fast as far as wargs go, and they have an 8 defense, which means that they're not. You don't want to leave them in prolonged melee because they are still camels and they will get hit really, really hard by foot infantry. But with a 7 melee attack, 125% movement speed, and a 6 charge as well, it means they will kill things. And cavalry is cavalry. Wargs have been buffed either in version 4 or version 3. I don't remember, but they now are a lot faster and they have more mass, so they actually are useful in a charge. They also scare horses, as all wargs do, which mean they can kill enemy early tier cavalry well. Say if you came up against the Northern Dunedain and needed to kill their Cartolin units or anything like that. They're really good at they're good at what they do. They're a solid unit, but they're still trash as far as early tier cavalry goes. So they're a C tier of altogether being a mediocre unit. Then we have the Warg Scouts, and the Warg Scouts are not as good. they're really not. Warg Scouts, oh, they might even be F tier. I don't know. I just looked at their stats and remembered they only have a 5 missile attack on a crossbow, which means with the low firing rate, ooh, 5, even effective against armor, they are definitely an F tier unit. That is really bad. This unit will only be useful if you have a weakened, heavily armored unit that you need to pick off, but they will fire so slowly and not do very much damage at all, and when they're finished with their crossbows that probably have terrible accuracy, they are not good in melee. They only have a 4 melee attack with a 5 charge and 7 defense. So they're significantly less aggressive in melee than your Warg Riders, and geez, a 5 missile attack for a crossbow unit is quite terrible. 90 range as well means that they have to be really up close and personal. I mean, this is really only good for picking off a single isolated unit, plinking in some kills, but man, that is really bad for mounted cavalry. Crossbows need to be able to do some damage, and 5 missile attack is really just not good. Maybe I'm wrong. Like I said, I've never played the Goblins of Moria, so maybe Warg Scouts are actually a great unit, and I'm wrong. But looking at their stats, they really just do not have what it takes to cut anywhere other than super situational, not really worth training at all. Now we come into units that actually do something. Heavy Goblin Infantry. Again, the C tier is going to get really big here because they, again, are just painfully average. Now, compared to any other elites for any other faction, they're pretty much as bad as it gets. But there still is 250 of them. That is a running theme in that all of your units are the max unit size, at least for your infantry units, which means they are about numbers and swarms. And their stats are passable. They have a 6 melee attack with a 14 defense, which means that they can actually exist in combat. Now, for reference, that is worse than the Dunedain Wardens, which are the first tier for the Northern Dunedain, but they can stick around. There are a lot of them, and again, it's with Goblins of Moria, it's not about how the individual unit does, it's how you'll probably have a 20 stack against their 5 units or whatever, and you'll have a ton of those 20 stacks. You can just drown your enemy in trash. And that's how it looks for the heavy goblin infantry, even though the individual unit is definitely nothing special. For your faction, they get up into the C tier because I have to rank for the Goblins of Moria, especially everything based on your faction a lot more. After I talked about how within the whole game is important, but otherwise everything would be D or F tier for this faction, and that's no fun. So the heavy goblin infantry are good at what they do. They are your most reliable infantry unit that you get, but they will 1v1 kill almost nothing. But the fact that there are so many of them means that even any losses that you take do not matter at all. It's just about winning the battle, and that is the beauty of the Goblins of Moria. Now the heavy goblin halberd are not that good, but they also are okay at what they do. They have a 5 melee attack that is effective against armor, of course, because they're halberds, and they have a 12 defense, which means we did the Ara Adonayam last week, and actually, if I look it up, Rosadon Halber. Did I spell that wrong? I've definitely spelled it wrong. Alright, see. Rosedon Halberdiers here. We have the Rosedon Halberdiers with a 4 melee attack and a 10 defense. They are a Halberdier unit for the early game for the Ara Denium that we did last week. And they have comparable stats to your heavy goblin halberds, if that gives any indication on your unit quality. But again, dirt cheap, massive numbers, and their stats are something where they will still kill things. And again, it's about the rest of the army. Also, I do think the look of the goblin units is nice, so they rank a little bit better. They do what they do, but again, nothing at all that makes them a good unit by any stretch of the imagination. But that is not the case for the Heavy Goblin Archers, which are a B tier unit. Now, in terms of stats, this unit is D tier. They're terrible. They have only a 4 missile attack, which in terms of, I should say, damage dealing potential, they're a D tier because they're terrible. Because there's 75 orcs in the EDU, which, if I do math, is about 175, 200, like 190-ish goblins with a 4 missile attack. Now, that is actually really terrible. For example, Dale, random faction that I just came up with, their mid-tier, like early game archers have a 4 missile attack. But they do have an 170 meter range, which is still pretty bad, but it is better than the 140 it was for the Goblin Archers. And they have 28 missiles, which is 12 more than your previous Archer unit, which is a significant upgrade. These people at least have the missiles to fire for the entire battle. And 4 missile attack means that they will kill things, and their accuracy is better. Once they're done with their bows, they are a 5/12, which means they have the same stats as your halberds without the effective against armor, so they can kill things in melee as well once they're done with their bows. But all of this means that they would be C tier. They have bad missile attack, and their unit size is not as big as your others, but they have more missiles, which bumps them up 1. But the big thing that puts them in B tier, the thing that makes them a good unit, is they have poison arrows, which do morale damage. For example, if a unit comes in fresh, ready to go, and they get hit with poison arrows, they will immediately drop down to shaken, which is so useful. Having a unit that can break the other army when your army won't be able to cut it 1v1 in melee is so important. So then you can break the unit quicker, and then your trash can win easier and just run down prisoners instead of having to slog through the entire enemy. If the enemy army does not have a general, especially poison arrows can easily break units if they are even close. If they're shaken already, shoot them with some poison arrows, they will be wavering and almost broken. So the Heavy Goblin Archers, just solely because of their poison arrows, are a good unit. They still will not kill too many things. They still only have 4 missile attack, but poison arrows can break units. They are a very useful unit for you. Then we come on to the heavy goblin crossbows. Now, the heavy goblin crossbows are D tier. The heavy goblin crossbow. Now, I bet you people are going to think that I have something against crossbows, but I truthfully don't. I actually really like crossbows. But the heavy goblin crossbows have a 7 missile attack, which is quite poor, just like your Warg scouts. 7 missile attack, for reference, is about the same as early tier crossbows for any other faction that gets them. See, if I look up, see, the Arid Lewin Scouts, maybe they're a crossbow nation. Arid Lewin Scouts have a 7 missile attack with a 150 meter range, 26 missiles. All right, now we go back to the heavy goblin crossbows. Heavy Goblin Crossbows have a 7 missile attack with an 140 meter range and 26 missiles. So your Heavy Goblin Crossbows are worse than the Arid Lewin Scouts. That's all that needs to be said. I like crossbows. Yes, they're effective against armor, but 7 missile attack is quite poor for crossbows. So they're still really just not a good unit. I mean, still train them. They will round out with missile fire, but your Heavy Goblin Archers are so superior to Heavy Goblin Crossbows unless you're fighting a faction, unless you're fighting, say, the dwarves, who you need a lot of armor piercing against, then you would train the Heavy Goblin Crossbows. But they don't do the morale damage that your archers do, and 7 missile attack is really just not that good. They're also more defensive. They have a 4 melee attack, but they're just worse in melee as well. They have a 4 melee attack with an 11 defense, which is worse than your archers. So all around, they're just really not that good of a unit. You would only, in my opinion, train these if you really need an armor-piercing unit in your army, so if you were fighting Khazad-dûm. But other than that, 7 missile attack, that's really bad. I mean, I get that the goblins are terrible, but I feel like for a upper tier unit, at least an 8 missile attack to distinguish themselves from the early tiers of other factions. 7 missile attack is just not good for a crossbow unit. Now we have the Mountain Urks, and the Mountain Urks are quite good. The Mountain Urks have a 12 melee attack with a 21 defense. They actually get above 20 defense. I believe the next highest was your Goblin Infantry, right? With like 15. Your Heavy Goblin Infantry. Heavy Goblin Infantry had a defense of 14. So your Mountain Urks are far, far better. And your Mountain Urks are an A tier unit. As far as infantry goes, they are your best unit. There's nothing else to be said about it. 12 attack with 6 charge means that they will definitely kill things. They're not armor piercing, which is unfortunate, so they're not as damaging, but still a 12 melee attack is quite good. And they have a 21 defense, which means that they will survive for a long time, and 13 of which is an armor, so you want to be careful about armor piercing, but 7 defense skill is still actually passable, and this makes them a good unit. They also frighten enemy infantry, which is super useful, so if you combine your Mountain Urks with your poison arrows, that is 2 separate morale dampening effects that will stack with each other to easily break enemy infantry. So you can rely on routing instead of needing your trash to win 1v1 battles. And they still have a, math. They have 140 orcs in the battalion, which means that it's still quite a large battalion as far as like elite tier infantry goes, which makes them quite a good unit. Definitely not S tier. As far as two-handed sword units go, they are not very good, but for your units, they are your best infantry unit. Now we come on to the Cave Trolls, and the Cave Trolls are A. Now, the Cave Trolls are the worst trolls in the game. They are not as good as Trolls of the White Hand, Snow Trolls, or Olag High, but they are still trolls, and they are still really useful. Again, they frighten enemy infantry. They have 5 hit points. They have 38 attack with a 10 charge bonus and 30 defense. Now, they also, I believe, have the largest unit size of any trolls. There's about 12 of them. Actually, that sounds like it's about the same as all the other ones. But still, they're the worst trolls in the game, but trolls are still trolls, and they will supplement your armies well. You can break up enemy formations, and that will allow you to just surround them in your trash instead of having to slog through a choke point. Trolls are really, really good at destroying enemy lines and allowing you to swarm through with your hordes. And the Cave Trolls, despite being worse, are still a phenomenal unit. They're not S tier because they're the worst trolls, but they're great. They are trolls, and they're one of your best units. So they are a solid A tier. Now we come on to the last elite unit that you get, the Azog's Defilers. I believe they used to be called the Bolg's Champions back when this faction was the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. And the Azog's Defilers are also a pretty dang good cavalry unit. And they are B tier, not quite A tier. The Azog's Defilers have a 13 attack with a 14 charge and 18 defense. They also have a 10% movement speed bonus. But they are not as good as far as wargs go for other elite wargs go for other factions. They're not as good as, say, Angmar's Mount Graham units. But they are still really, really strong wargs. And wargs, I've noticed, have this thing where they're not... Obviously, camels are not as fast as horses on the battle map. But they seem to get a burst of acceleration right before they charge into units, which means they can be devastating on the charge. They do also frighten enemy infantry, so at your upper tiers, you really get a lot of morale-shocking units. But the unit size is not particularly large. There's about 60 of them, which means that they're not an overwhelmingly large force like the rest of yours. And as far as cavalry go, they're still not amazing, but they are one of your best units. Again, they're very strong, and 18 defense means that they will stand up decently well. They also frighten enemy horses as well. Wargs always scare horses, which makes them quite effective at battling other cavalry. For example, if you came up against Dunedain cavalry who have better stats, these will frighten the horses, which will make your Azog's Defilers actually win. They don't actually get a bonus against mounts, though, which is... Oh, no, they do. They get a... Specifically, against horses, they get a +2. So, I take that back. So, they are definitely good cavalry killers, and they will be quite devastating in the charge. But I believe they're limited in training, I think. I could be wrong about that, but I think you can't train them from everywhere as well, which means that you're not going to get a whole lot of these, so you're going to be mostly limited. So that keeps them down from the A tier, but they're still quite a good unit and one that you will want to train at any opportunity that you find. So that is it for the standard infantry, but now I included the Flame Wrangler and the Troll Catapult, since they are unique siege infantry. I obviously haven't been including the normal Catapult and Ballistas, or the trebuchets that other units get. But I figured for unique siege weapons like Dwarven Catapults, the Flame Wrangler, Troll Catapults, I would include. So the Flame Wrangler is an A tier unit. Flame Wrangler is basically just a trebuchet, but it does the thing where it explodes and showers the fire on the enemy, which makes it actually very, very effective at destroying clumped up units. It's sort of like the Dwarven Catapult and how it has the mortar shot, but this affects a larger area. Really good for breaking up lines. The fire can frighten enemy units and hurt their morale. It's just all around a good unit. Also, it's still a siege weapon, so it makes it quite useful, but it's really good for destroying clumps of units. You know, since it fires over top, it doesn't fire through, so it decreases slightly the chance of friendly fire. And it could do quite a lot of AoE damage. If you're in a siege or something, and the enemy groups up in one spot, this will rack up a lot of kills. Now, the Troll Catapult, honestly, is an S tier unit for any faction that gets it, because it's a catapult, and then it's a unit of trolls. That's just incredibly strong. There's nothing else to be said about it. I mean, yeah, Troll Catapult. Catapults are good, and trolls are really good, so when you put them together in one unit, what more could you want? They are an S tier unit. They are phenomenal. As far as siege goes, they're pretty much the most useful ones. Dwarven Catapult's also up there. But it just puts together two phenomenal units. I know that's a little bit cheesy to have the Troll Catapult, and maybe it's to be expected. But I figured I'd throw it in because, look, trolls are already A tier. Catapults would also be around, and when you put them together into one good package, they become S tier. A phenomenal unit that is really useful. I mean, there's never a situation where that unit won't be useful in an army. And so, it's S tier. Lastly, we come to the Goblin Bodyguards. Again, for some reason, this website duplicates one of my images every time, so ignore the last thing. The Goblin Bodyguards, as far as bodyguards go, are average. Actually, as far as bodyguards go, they're really not that good at all. But they have a 9 melee attack with 22 defense. Decent stats, nothing to write home about. They will survive, they will protect your general. They can get some kills in the early game, but they're nothing to write home about as far as bodyguards go at all. So that wraps up the tier list for the Goblins of Moria. As expected, they're really centered around the lower tiers here. A lot of units in C, D, and F tier, especially a lot in C. But they have the odd units that stand out as good, and then Troll Catapults are just amazing. They're just incredibly useful, and I wanted to throw them in for fun. Let me know what you think. Make your own tier list if you disagree. I don't know. Tell me what I did wrong. Tell me what you liked. I love discussing the tier list with people. I've really enjoyed that for the last 2 videos that I've done. Let's Play should be coming out within the coming days. I've got recommendations to do it for a faction that I'm not going to reveal yet. But it should be quite fun, and I'm very excited to get started. I thank the couple of people that recommended the faction that I'm going to play. It was also, I should say, that faction was recommended for a tier list, but I'm going to be holding off on doing the tier list until I've played the faction a little bit in the Let's Play, because I've never actually played that faction before, so I would like to get a feel for how they actually play before tier listing their units. With all that being said, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all later.